talking about Rip Van Winkle. So, lots of romanticism in this story. Somebody tell me, give me an example. Throw out some example of romanticism.
It's weird.
Okay.
Some stories are so weird.
They can be a little strange. Just wait till we read Nathaniel Hawthorne's birthmark. So you've got a little taste of him with Young Goodman Brown.
An element in the story?
Yes.
Supernatural.
Yes. Okay. There's supernatural in Rip Van Winkle. What is supernatural, Bailey?
Whenever he talks to the spirits, he falls asleep.
Okay. So he talks to these spirits. There's the little guys that are playing, what do they call it? 10 pin, 9 pin. Was 9 pin at bowling. That's what that means. But that's what they used to call it, was 9 pin. And so he, well, before I delve into that too much, so he certainly, that would be supernatural. He talks to these little spirits, and we'll talk about who they are later. What else is supernatural about the story? I would say sleeping for 20 years would constitute supernatural. So yeah, that's certainly outside the realm of possibility. So that, I would say that was supernatural. Anything else? What other elements of romanticism do you see in the story? Okay, the frontier. So it takes place in the Catskill Mountains, the Appalachian. We'll talk about that a little bit too, where this is actually taking place and how that's significant. So it's the Hudson Bay area at the foot of the Catskill Mountains. And of course, Rip goes up to the Catskill Mountains when he goes to take his nap and such. And so the frontier, it's undeveloped. It's undeveloped. It's not that it's uncivilized, but there's just it's undeveloped. So you don't have any. It's out in the I would call it somewhat the wilderness, but you don't have like anything that might be considered industrialization or anything industrialized or anything along those lines. So definitely the frontier. What else?
Nature.
Nate.
They describe him like going into nature, I think climbing the mountains and stuff.
Lots of nature, referring to nature. In fact, how does Rip get away from his haranguing wife? He what now? Yeah, he goes fishing. I mean, he goes and leaves. He just, but I mean, sometimes he goes to see his friends and, that kind of thing, the junto. But he goes out into nature. He loves to go and fish. In fact, that's, he falls asleep and that's when he goes to sleep for 20 years. But that's how he gets away from his nagging wife. He goes out into nature. So in that aspect, that element of nature, there's great description about nature and the beauty of this area. And again, that goes to frontier as well. So it's undeveloped and, much beauty in nature. So that is definitely a big element. What else? Any other elements of romanticism that you see? What about symbolism?
Yeah.
Did you see any symbolism in this story?
A little bit.
Okay. What symbolism?
I find it in like deep analysis.
Okay.
For me at least, I guess the way it is that read, he was kind of this guy who lived in the older times of the Revolutionary War and then fell asleep and then woke up again, and he still represents that time era that he's from.
Okay.
Sort of what these people who are in the Revolutionary time kind of represents like sort of that nostalgia of earlier times.
Okay, good. And yes, there is quite a lot of symbolism, and the romantics love symbolism. And when we get to Young Goodman Brown, we talk about that. There's a lot of symbolism in that, a lot of symbolism in Hawthorne's work. And so you see a lot of symbolism in here. We'll break some of that down in just a little bit. But you said something now, I forgot what it was. Oh, nostalgia.
Yeah, he sort of like represents this blissfulness of not knowing about the Revolutionary War.
Okay. And that can go to, the romantics tended to, I don't want to say they put their head in the sand, not to that, anything that would be overkill and wasn't anything to that extent. But they tended to be more, remember, that's why romanticism came into being anyway, is because people were tired of war, and in Europe they had the French Revolution, and so the Brits were tired of war and all this kind of thing. Well, then it was the same thing with the Americans. By the time you had this movement into American romanticism, hadn't been that long since they'd gotten out of a revolution. So there was this wanting to turn away from the seriousness of life. So a lot of escapism going on. And so you have a lot of escapism going on in the story. And they also like their nostalgia. They like to look, remember, they were not forward thinking people. I don't mean that they weren't intelligent, anything but they didn't tend, like the thinkers of the Age of Reason in the Enlightenment period, they were very different from that. They didn't tend to think so much forward as they did looking back on their ancestors and those that came before them. They felt that there was a lot to be learned from those that came before them. And so you do have this, certainly some nostalgia going on there. And definitely represents an old way of thinking and very much pre-revolution. Any other elements of romanticism that you see in this story? Well, why don't we just start breaking it down, and we might run into some more things. I want to just point out to you at the very beginning, again, there's a lot of symbolism in the story. Whoever has made a voyage up the Hudson must remember the Catskill Mountains. They are a branch of the great Appalachian family and are seen away to the west of the river, swelling to a noble height and lording it over the surrounding country. That is important because we talked about the Revolutionary War plays a huge role in the story. And so you do have a lot of symbolism and experiencing with the colonist experience, because the people, including Rip, at the beginning of the story, they would be the colonists. Okay? Now, I do want to point out, and I might have already told y'all this before when we first started reading this, that this area, so this is taking place in New York. And at this time, New York was actually a Dutch colony. Okay? So there's a lot of Dutch influence, and you see it in this story. And so that's something to kind of keep in mind. In fact, it even alludes to the Dutch and this sort of thing. So that's something to keep in mind. But you have a lot of symbolism going to pre-revolution in the colonists and what they were experiencing before they formed a country. So you have at the very beginning talking about is comparing the Hudson River Valley and talking about the Catskill Mountains. And the Catskills are a branch of the great Appalachian family. However, they're a branch of it. They're not actually a part of it per se, and they are lorded over the Appalachians lord over the Catskill Mountains in the surrounding country. What does that sound like? And what do you think that might be symbolic of? You have this one great area, mountainous region, and then you have a mountainous region that's smaller, that's detached, and the large mountainous region is lording it over the smaller, almost like bullying the smaller Appalachian mountain range. What does that sound like? That's right. That's exactly what it's talking about. So you have a lot of symbolism going to pre-revolution in the things that the colonists experienced at the hand of the Brits. Okay? So that's just one example of that. So again, the Romantics love their symbolism, and that's a very good example right at the beginning. So they're under Dutch rule, New York is at this point, not British rule. So it even alludes to, I'm looking at the next page, let's see, and a lot, again, going to nature. There's this, also, I would point out too, that Washington Irving, much like Nathaniel Hawthorne and Poe, a lot of detail in their writing. And so he details how very beautiful this area is. At the foot of these fairy mountains, the traveler may have seen the light smoke curling up from a village whose shingle roofs gleaming among the trees. So even though there's, you do have homes, so you have that kind of development, but you notice the, anything that would be considered to be advancement in any ways, where they live, their houses, it still does not take away from the beauty of nature. In fact, their roofs just gleam among the trees. The fresh green of the nearer landscape, it's a little village of great age, so the Dutch, having been founded by some Dutch colonists in the early time of the province. In that same village and in one of these very houses, there lived many years since while the country was yet a province of Great Britain, a simple, good-natured fellow, the name of Rip Van Winkle. So then it starts talking about Rip Van Winkle, and it introduces him. I have observed, now we don't really know who I is, but I will tell you that this story, if you'll remember from our slideshow that we had earlier, last week or whenever that was, when we were talking about Washington Irving, that this story comes from the sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon. So that was one of the pseudonyms that he wrote under. And if you'll remember, there was an old Dutch historian that Washington Irving also used as a pseudonym, Derek Knickerbocker. And so we don't really know if this would be Knickerbocker talking or Geoffrey Crayon, because it's almost like this story is some recovered text from a long time previous. And you have this old historian, Mr. Knickerbocker, he's kind of retelling it. But it's someone, it would be one of those two, we don't really know which one for sure, that they're an outside observer and they're talking about Rip and giving his story. So I would guess it's probably Mr. Knickerbocker, the oldest Dutch historian, observed that he was a simple, good-natured man. He was, moreover, a kind neighbor and an obedient, henpecked husband. What does henpecked mean, by the way? I don't hear that term much anymore. A henpecked husband. Think about it. What do you think that might mean? Who would be the hen? Huh?
Kind of sounds like his wife.
Yeah. To be henpecked means the hen, which would be the wife, is pecking at him. So she's always nagging him. So he is, Rip is being described as a very good-natured man. He's a kind neighbor, and he's obedient, but he's a henpecked husband. So again, if we're talking about pre-Revolutionary War, and we're talking about the colonies here, or in specific, the New York colony, and we're talking about Britain, you see some symbolism going on here. So who would Rip represent and be symbolic of? Hmm? Come on in, girl. Okay, who goes next? Demo? So who do you think Rip would be symbolic of and representing? The colonies, that's right. So the colonies, pre-revolution. So Rip would be representing, he's a good neighbor, he's kind-hearted, he's obedient, and the colonists were until they decided they were going to go to war with Britain. But if you know your history and all, you know that the colonists tried to do what they were supposed to do. But the Brits, who would be represented by who? The wife. That's exactly right. So you have, excuse me, Rip, symbolic of the colonies, and his henpecking, needling, meddling wife, who keeps him down and keeps him from being able to be a better person would be the Brits. Because that's exactly what they did to the colony. They kept them from being able to really grow. And I don't mean size-wise, but I'm talking about they kept them from being able to be all that they could be because they put tariffs on them and certain laws, and they made it very, very difficult for the colonists within the colonies to better themselves, to actually make a good livelihood. They kept them down. And so that's what a lot of what you see happening here. And we'll talk about old Dame Van Winkle in just a moment, but she very much henpecked Rip. All right, here's a little bit about Dame Van Winkle right here. Certain it is that he was a great favorite among all the good wives of the village. So everybody else loved Rip, right? Who took his part in all family squabbles. They always sided with him and never failed, whenever they talked those matters over in the evening gossipings, to lay all the blame on Dame Van Winkle. All right, so she could also, in addition to really just being even representing Britain, she could even be, do you know who was the king at this time? I think he's mentioned in here who the King of England was. I don't remember. I think it mentions it. Maybe it's towards the end.
Later on in the story.
Yeah, I think it is. It's King George. That's right. And so you could think of King George the Third. Huh?
He was insane.
Yeah, he was. He was not a good leader at all. And he treated the colonies very poorly. And so you could almost think of Dame Van Winkle as even just representing crazy George the Third. But either way, always meddling in the business of the colonies, needling them, henpecking them, keeping them down. The children of the village would shout with joy whenever he approached. So everybody loved Rip. They would come around him. The kids loved him. Even the little dogs. He was always quick to help a neighbor lady, needed her fence mended or anything like that. The great error, however, in Rip's composition was a strong dislike of all kinds of profitable labor. So Rip, he would work and help everybody else out, but he didn't really care to work to make money and bring money home to his family. But it could not be from the want of perseverance, for he would sit on a wet rock with a rod as long and heavy as a lance and fish all day without a murmur, even though he should not be encouraged by a single nibble. So it wasn't that he didn't have the perseverance to seek work and to work hard, but he didn't bring home money to his family, and he was also extremely slack with keeping the home up. So why do you think about a minute, that Rip was very slow to help out at his own house or to bring money home to his own family?
Well, the colonies took a long time to set up their own government but they were part of Britain's rule for a long time.
Okay.
He didn't bring it to himself, but he left it.
Okay, that's a good point.
If his wife represents Britain at this point, I'm not really sure. Maybe they're helping the other people, we still traded with people.
Mhm.
And the French came and helped us in the war.
Yes.
The Revolutionary War, and having the colonists like him so much was being there.
Okay, that's a great point. But we know, and you said this, that King George in Britain really kept the colonies down and the colonists. And all these rules and laws and tariffs and such kept them down, much like Dame Van Winkle kept Rip down. He was more than happy to help everybody else, but when it came to his own house, his own home, he just didn't have the desire, to do that, because Dame Van Winkle so, needled him and so put him down and made him feel bad and this sort of thing. He just couldn't reach the full potential that he could have maybe if he had a woman that was supportive, a wife that was supportive, much like the colonies could have probably, if Britain hadn't kept her thumb on them and kept them from growing and doing better or giving them opportunity, they could have probably thrived too. His children too were as ragged and wild as if they belonged to nobody. So even the kids, his son, Rip Jr., was much like his dad, even at the end of the story. When Rip goes home, well, there's his son, Rip Jr., leaning against the tree and, seems to not accomplish much in his life. So you have even his children are very much like he is. If left to himself, he would have whistled life away in perfect contentment, but his wife kept continually dinging his ear about his idleness, his carelessness, and the ruin he was bringing to his family. As time grew worse and worse with Rip, so many years he's been married to the dame, and things just get worse between them. She's got a terrible temper. I love this line, a tart temper never mellows with age. So as she gets older, she gets even a worse temper and a worse temperament, and a sharp tongue is the only edged tool that grows keener with constant use. This is, I thought, really interesting. The opinions of this junto, now this is talking about sometimes Rip, when he wasn't escaping from the dame to go fishing, sometimes he would meet with a group of other men. And in front of Nicholas Vedder's, his little inn, I guess it would be. And they called this group the junto or junto, Junto, which is an interesting word. Anybody ever heard that before? I know what that might mean. That is in reference to Ben Franklin, who I absolutely forgot that we were going to read him. I just went right to the romantics. It's kind of a little boring, but we may need to go back because we didn't even cover that time period. So we need to revisit or go back and visit Ben Franklin, and this would all make more sense. But Ben Franklin would mean, I don't know if y'all know this or not, but he started the public library system. And so before there was a public library system, which he started, there was this group of men, and they were all, I remember we're talking about the Age of Reason now, the Enlightenment period. And so you had all these great thinkers. So the Ben Franklins, the Thomas Jeffersons, Thomas Paine. And so you had these men that really embraced government and politics and philosophical thinking, and they would get together and they would trade books with each other. Because, at that time, books were still fairly hard to come about, to find. You could find them, but they were also could be very expensive because there wasn't a whole lot of them. So these men got together and they were called a junto or the junto, Junto. So I thought that is kind of interesting that, because you don't hear that word used anymore, but that is making reference, Washington Irving making reference to Ben Franklin there. So he called this group of men that would meet in front of Thomas Vedder's inn, this junto, and they would read and so it's very much alluded to, and they talked about government and, there was, of course, talk of war, and all this sort of thing, and what was going to happen, and, dissatisfaction with Britain and all this sort of thing. So it's very much alluded to that these men, including Rip, they were bright men. They were not dumb, including Rip. He was not a dumb man. He just wasn't given opportunity. I guess you could look at it that way. But anyway, they would, talk, read the newspaper, smoke their pipes, this sort of thing. Of course, here would come Dame Van Winkle, and she would see him there, and she would very much call him out. From even this stronghold, the unlucky Rip was at length routed by his termagant wife, who would suddenly break in upon the tranquility of the assemblage and call the members all to naught. Nor was that august personage, Nicholas Vedder himself, sacred from the daring tongue of this terrible virago. So it's talking about, again, the wife, Dame Van Winkle, being very much like Britain or even King George. Things are going along pretty well, and here she comes and breaks things up and lets them have it with, England placing tariffs on them and things like that. So Rip is reduced to despair, and he tries to escape from the labor of the farm and clamor of his wife, was to take gun in hand and stroll away into the woods. So again, this is much like the colonies trying to escape and get away from the Brits or from King George. Again, we have a lot of alluding to nature and romanticism. Washington Irving goes into a lot of detail describing the scene. So one day, one autumnal day, Rip had unconsciously scrambled to one of the highest parts of the Catskill Mountains. So he and Wolf, and by the way, Wolf couldn't even escape the wrath of Dame Van Winkle. But he takes his gun, he takes his dog, and they go up to the Catskill Mountains. He's got his fishing pole. No, he doesn't. Sorry. I forgot. I was thinking he was fishing. He was actually going squirrel shooting. So he had his gun, and panting and fatigued, he threw himself late in the afternoon on a green knoll covered with mountain herbage. So again, a lot of alluding to the beauty of nature. On the other side, he looked down into a deep mountain glen, wild and lonely, the bottom filled with fragments from the overhanging cliffs and scarcely lighted by the reflected rays of the setting sun. For some time, Rip lay musing on the scene. Evening was gradually advancing. The mountains began to throw their long blue shadows over the valleys, and he heaved a heavy sigh when he thought of encountering the terrors of Dame Van Winkle, because he knows when he goes back home, he's going to have her wrath, because he took a day to go off into nature, so escapism there, to escape her and to go enjoy himself, and that he knows he's going to pay for it when he gets back home. As he was about to descend, he heard a voice from a distance hallooing, "Rip Van Winkle, Rip Van Winkle." He looked around, but could see nothing but a crow winging its solitary flight across the mountain. Again, he hears the same cry, calling his name, and at the same time, Wolf bristled up his back and, giving a low growl, skulked to his master's side, looking fearfully down into the glen. So, on nearer approach, so Rip sees something coming towards him. He was surprised, Rip was, at the singularity of a stranger's appearance. He was a short, square-built old fellow with thick, bushy hair and a grizzled beard. His dress was of the antique Dutch fashion. A cloth jerkin strapped around his waist and several pair of breeches, and that is breeches, which is different from like breeches. I forget, there's something they would like pull up if you've ever, like the Revolutionary, if you've ever seen photos from, not photos, but paintings or drawings from that time. So it would be like pants, but they would pull them up somewhere. The outer one of ample volume, decorated with rows of buttons down the sides. He bore on his shoulder a stout keg that seemed full of liquor, and made signs for Rip to approach and assist him with the load. Though rather shy and distrustful of the new acquaintance, Rip complied with his usual alacrity, and relieving one another, they clambered up a narrow gully, apparently to drive out of a mountain torrent. So he sees this guy, this old Dutch guy, or he's judging he's Dutch from his clothing. And this man, anybody have any idea? Remember, this is taking place in the Hudson River Valley. So this man is very symbolic of somebody. Is this a real person, by the way, that he is supposedly encountering? No. This is would be like a spirit of sorts, or in his dreams, because at this point, he's obviously going into his long slumber. But he helps this Dutch man that we'll name in just a moment, and they ascend this mountain. And Rip every now and then heard long rolling peals like distant thunder that seemed to issue out a deep ravine between lofty rocks. So he would hear what sounded like thunder. And it turned out they got closer, and they came to like this amphitheater. And he sees that there's these men. They look much like the man that he's helped carry this barrel of whiskey or whatever. And they are dressed similar to him. They all have long beards. And there's Some of them were stout old gentlemen with a weather-beaten countenance. And so it turns out that these men, and they talk him into drinking some of the draft, don't they? Which is probably then, part of the big mistake, but he's already gone to sleep anyway, so it probably didn't matter. But maybe that's what led to him being asleep for 20 years. And so Rip thinks these people are odd, like he's thinking in his dream. Though these folks were evidently amusing themselves, they maintained the greatest faces. They're playing 9 pins or 10 pins. Is it 9 pins or 10 pins? I can't remember. But I think it's 9 pins, which is essentially that's bowling. So they were playing, rolling these balls, and they were hitting these club things or whatever that they had set up. And that's what was making the peals of thunder. So again, we have a lot going back to nature. And he's noticing that they look odd to him, but they seem kind of almost familiar to him. Nothing interrupted the stillness of the scene but the noise of the balls, which, whenever they were rolled, echoed along the mountains like rumbling peals of thunder. As Rip and his companion approached them, they suddenly desisted from their play and they stare at him. They tell him to sit down. They have now emptied the contents of the keg into large flagoons, which would be like big things cups you would drink from, and made signs to him to wait upon the company. He obeyed with fear and trembling, so he's scared of them. They quaffed the liquor in profound silence and then returned to their game. But by degrees, Rip's awe and apprehension subsided, and he even ventured, when no eye was fixed upon him, to taste the beverage, which he found had much of the flavor of excellent Hollands. He was naturally a thirsty soul, so anyway, he drinks quite a bit. And so, maybe this supposedly contributes to his going to sleep for 20 years. But again, we have a lot of symbolism going on. And supposedly the Dutch man that he first comes upon, that he helps carry the keg of the beer or whatever draught, is Henry Hudson. So Henry Hudson, who was a great adventurer, and he was an explorer, and he's actually who discovered in New York State the Hudson River Valley and Catskill Mountains and all that. So that's why it's named after him. So supposedly this would be very symbolic, this Dutch man, again, referring back to the Dutch ancestry and the Dutch who actually first came upon New York and New York State and this sort of thing. So that's alluding to Henry Hudson and his group of explorers. So then we have 20 years later now, and Rip wakes up. He's rubbing his eyes. He thinks he's just going to sleep for the night. He knows he's going to get in some trouble when he has to go see old Dame Van Winkle. He's calling for his dog, and he's also, by the way, he's got a hangover, I guess, and he's blaming the drought that he drank. That flagoon. And he's thinking that's what made him fall asleep for the night, but little does he know it's really been 20 years. So he's calling for Wolf. Wolf doesn't come. He doesn't answer him. He looks for his gun, but in place of the clean, well-oiled fowling piece, he found an old firelock lying by him, and it's been the barrel encrusted with rust and the stock worm-eaten. So 20 years later, the gun, not much left of it. So anyway, he's thinking, he needs to get back home. So we have a lot of description with him going down the forest and this sort of thing. And he's full of anxiety, and he's very troubled because he knows that when he gets down and has to confront Dame Van Winkle, that he's going to get it because he spent the night in the woods. He approaches the village. He meets a number of people, but he doesn't recognize any of them. And he's very surprised because he knows everyone in town. And he notices that their dress was of a different fashion from what he was accustomed to. And they're all looking at him too, because they don't recognize him either, and they're staring at him. He's now entered the skirts of the village. A troop of strange children ran at his heels, hooting after him and pointing at his gray beard. The dogs don't recognize him. The village was altered. It was larger and more populous. There were rows of houses which he had never seen before, and those which had been his familiar haunts had disappeared. So the village has completely changed. Strange names were over the doors, strange faces at the windows. Everything was strange. His mind now misgave him. He began to doubt whether both he and the world around him were not bewitched. So he cannot figure out what was going on. He's very perplexed, but he keeps blaming it on what he drank the night before. He finds his way to his own house, and he's expecting to hear the shrill voice of Dame Van Winkle, but he finds his house has gone to decay. The roof has fallen in, the windows shattered, and the doors off the hinges. A half-starved dog that looked like a wolf was poking around, but the dog is snapping at him and baring his teeth and snarling and all this sort of thing. So he doesn't know what's happened to Wolf. He enters the house, and it's abandoned. It's in terrible shape, and he knows something's going on because Dame Van Winkle always kept a good, nice house. So now he's getting a little bit concerned. He's worried. He goes to the village inn, Better's village inn, where the Juntu would often meet, and it's now gone too. A large, rickety wooden building stood in its place with great gaping windows, and some of them broken and mended, with old hats and petticoats. And over the door was painted the Union Hotel by Jonathan Doolittle. So even the sign has now changed. And the old inn that Better owned is no longer standing. It's been torn down, I guess, and replaced. And we didn't talk about this earlier, but again, this is going very much to nature. There was a great tree that was outside of Nicholas Better's inn. And they could even tell the time by looking and judging the shadow of that big tree. So that's alluding to, a sundial, which again would be alluding to going back in time, and, the very opposite of anything forward thinking or any type of gains in technology or anything like that. So now the great tree that used to shelter the quiet little Dutch inn, there now was reared a tall, naked pole with something on the top that looked like a red nightcap, and from it was fluttering a flag on which was a singular assemblage of stars and stripes. All this was strange and incomprehensible. So the big old oak tree that stood in front of Nicholas Better's inn had now been replaced with a pole with American flag on it. So that very much goes to now you see 20 years later in advancement, not necessarily a good type, but advancement. So this very much is symbolic of the beauty of nature and the romantics appreciating nature. And so now nature is being spoiled by the advancements. So the tree's been replaced with a pole with a flag on top of it. He recognized on the sign, however, the ruby face of King George, under which he had smoked so many a peaceful pipe. But even this was singularly changed. The red coat was changed for one of blue and buff. A sword was held in one hand instead of a scepter. The head was decorated with a cocked hat, and underneath was painted in large characters, General Washington. So King George's drawing or whatever, depicting his King George on the sign, has now, with the red coat, which the red coat's obviously, alluding to the Brits, has now been replaced by the blue coats, which would be the Americans, and General George Washington. Of course, he doesn't know who Washington is. So there's a crowd of folk about the door. Rip did not recognize any of them. He looks for Nicholas Better. He looks for the schoolmaster, Van Bummel, who used to be part of the junto that he would visit with and talk with. He doesn't see any of them. In place of these, a lean fellow with his pockets full of handbills, which would be like, handbills would be like advertisements or something like that, was haranguing vehemently about rights of citizens, elections, members of Congress, Bunkers Hill, heroes of 76. In other words, which were a perfect jargon to the bewildered Van Winkle. So obviously, this man with the handbills, he's probably handing out information about certain people running for election or something. So all of this is very strange because if you'll remember, Rip would have never experienced anything in the form of elections because before he went to sleep and they were under British rule, they didn't have things like elections. So now, 20 years later, now they're America, and so home of the free, right? And so elections are going on. So that is completely new to him. He doesn't know what to make of that. Everybody's staring at him, and the orator bustled up to him and drawing him partly aside, inquired on which side he voted. And Rip doesn't know what to make of that. Rip stared in vacant stupidity. Another short but busy little fellow pulled him by the arm and rising on tiptoe inquired in his ear whether he was a Federal or a Democrat. Rip was equally at a loss, didn't know what the question meant. And Rip says, what brought him to the, this other man asked what brought him to the election with a gun on his shoulder and a mob at his heels, and whether he meant to breathe a riot in the village. And Rip says, I am a poor, quiet man, a native of the place and a loyal subject of the king. God bless him. Well, that wasn't the right thing to say, was it? That he was a follower of the king. There were general shouts burst from the bystanders. A Tory, a spy, a refugee, hustle him away with him. So they want to take him away because obviously that's not the right thing to say, that you still support the Brits and King George. So he has to kind of talk his way out of that because he doesn't even know what they're talking about. They tell him, he's asking where Nicholas Vedder is, and they tell him he's no longer alive. Okay, we'll finish up tomorrow. Have a good rest of your day.
Yeah.